I'm also pleased that you mentioned 9/11. I want to give a shout out to those first responders at 9/11, but also those that are responding today in Bermuda. My best friend from high school grew up in Half Moon Bay up north. He's the admiral in charge of the whole southeast area, the Coast Guard, and he and his group, the men and women of the Coast Guard, have been out there responding in the Bahamas since the time the hurricane hit. And these are the kinds of people too that we owe it to them to think more about the long-term future and the long-term resilience of our building stock. These are the men and women that have to go out there right away and put their own lives at risk in responding and helping the recovery of these disasters. And if we had more resilient communities, they wouldn't be, we wouldn't need them to do that as much. So thank you to them, and we owe it to them to be thinking about this topic. So I'm going to talk a little bit about resilience, what that means in the context of buildings and businesses and communities. The reason the U.S. Resiliency Council was started back in 2011. I am a structural engineer, and I know some of you say you won't hold that against me. I appreciate that. And my career has been built around building buildings, right? And focusing on a project at hand. But really what I've come to realize over the years is how central buildings are, obviously, to the resilience of an entire community. This slide here sort of shows you all the different functions we think of in a community. And when we think of the resilience of a community after a natural disaster, that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about how soon can these essential functions, whether they be schools or living spaces or businesses or grocery stores, how soon can they get back in operation? Because that's what it takes for a community to get back in operation. And what we know, of course, is that all of those things are typically done in buildings. And so the U.S. Resiliency Council was founded to kind of focus on how to design and build buildings more resiliently and educate the public about how that contributes to the overall resilience of a community, and then look for ways to partner with the various stakeholders in a community to incentivize owners and cities and insurance companies and lenders to promote resilient design. Just a point of reference here. If you look at the city of Los Angeles, there's a common misconception among the public that the buildings that we live in or we work in or we go to school in are safe, because why would a city ever allow you to be in a building that wasn't going to be safe in a natural disaster? But this graph, it's a pretty graph here with lots of colors. It represents the ages of buildings in the city of Los Angeles. And not to get into detail, but to basically say that it's only the very farthest to the right of that table, the 2000-ish buildings in orange, that represents buildings that really comply with what we consider modern building codes. Okay? And so the natural thing to see is that over 90% of the buildings in Los Angeles don't even comply with modern building codes, all right? And this graph, this picture isn't any different in San Francisco or Portland or New York City or Chicago or any major city, really. I mean, this is the way it is. We build buildings and we tend to use them for a long period of time, and we don't replace them that often. So we have a real issue in all of our communities about we've got buildings that meet code, and then we've got this vast swath of buildings that we really don't know that much about. And those buildings obviously house all the different functions that I showed in the previous slide. So the challenge that we face, the challenge that the USRC is trying to educate people on, is why it's important to focus on bringing all of our building stock, including existing buildings, but also the new buildings that we design to replace those existing buildings, making them resilient to natural disasters so that they perform well. So one of the cities that has really done sort of the leading job on this, not just in Southern California, but really around the country, is the city of Santa Monica. Close by, Santa Monica was one of the first cities after the Northridge earthquake to adopt some significant retrofit requirements for its old unreinforced masonry buildings. And then over the past couple years went above and beyond and instituted a retrofit and repair ordinance for many of its older vulnerable building types, older concrete buildings, older steel buildings, older apartment complexes with tuck-under parking. And so Santa Monica is really an example of the kind of leadership that we want communities to display around the country, is taking a holistic look at the kinds of hazards their buildings face and developing a long-term strategy to reduce those hazards, to require retrofits, to offer incentives, to work with the business community to make sure that over time our businesses not only are safe, our buildings not only safe, but they lead to a city that can get back to business as soon as possible. So the U.S. Resiliency Council has developed over about a 5-year time frame in working on this, a rating system for buildings. Most of you, I'm sure, have heard of the U.S. Green Buildings Council and the LEED rating system. And as Tracy said, that LEED system is really designed for green design. This idea that we want our buildings to have a low impact on the environment, that we don't want them to use a lot of energy, that we want them to use recycled materials and all that stuff, which is very laudable. But as she said, the opposite of that the environment has a low impact on our buildings, is what we see every time there's a hurricane in Florida or the wildfires in Paradise or an earthquake in California, where cities and communities can't recover because their buildings aren't resilient to the environment. So we developed a rating system using state-of-the-art engineering work that has been done by FEMA and engineers across California, across the country for over a decade, to develop a system that rates buildings based on not just how safe they are, which is essentially what the code is intended to do, but how much damage they'll suffer and how long they'll be out of operation after an earthquake. And now owners, tenants in buildings, lenders, insurance companies, cities, counties can start to say, okay, well, we have a system by which we can measure performance of buildings. Where do we want our buildings to fall? What kind of incentives can we offer based on the benefits we'll receive if buildings reach a different level of performance? And the good news, at least when it comes to new buildings, is to get from a kind of a code level design where you've got a building that's safe but maybe a throwaway after an earthquake, to a level of performance where that building will be occupiable and suffer repairable damage. That cost may be only a couple of % more than the base minimum building cost. And so the example I use is, and I show a number of 0 to 5% there, but really the number is more like 0 to 2 or 3%. And I use an example of if you have an $80,000 Corvette, right, and if it's a new Corvette, you drive it into a wall at 25 miles an hour, good news is you'll be able to walk away from that. With all the fancy safety features that they have in those cars now, you can walk away, but the car will be a total loss. But if you could spend an extra 1%, an extra $800 on that Corvette, and it would still look like a Corvette and drive like a Corvette, but if you drove it into a wall at 25 miles an hour, not only would you be able to walk away, but the car would be in the shop for 2 days and then be as good as new. Wouldn't you put that extra $800 into that car? Well, if you're going to do that for an $80,000 car, why wouldn't you do that for an $80 million building and spend 1% on what's likely to be your largest investment? Whether you're an owner of a building or a major tenant in a building, if your whole business is wrapped up in the space that you lease, understanding the performance of that building and working with your owner or trying to look for buildings that meet your needs resilience-wise, it's important. And what we've seen is what the U.S. Resiliency Council really wants to be able to do is use the market to promote this idea of resilient cells. And this is where working with the business community is so important. All our work with BizFed and Optimum Seismic over the past 3 years, really, is because we want to generate enthusiasm about building more resiliently. In San Francisco, if you build a building that gets a LEED Platinum rating, environmental friendliness, green design, it can get 15 or 20% more rent, or can be worth that much more if you're selling a condominium in that building or selling the building. But you don't get any benefit right now for building the building more seismically resistant. But in Tokyo, you can get up to 40% more rent or property value for buildings that achieve the highest level of seismic performance. And these two pictures on the right, if you Google on luxury apartment in Los Angeles or San Francisco or whatever, you're going to get a picture just like that. It's going to be at the rooftop of some condo with a fire pit. You're going to be overlooking city lights. That's what sells a multi-million-dollar apartment complex in a city like LA or San Francisco. But the picture on the right, on the bottom there, is a picture a friend of mine took on the subway in Tokyo. And this is a picture of what sells a luxury multi-million-dollar condominium in Tokyo. That's the basement of the building, and those are base isolators in that building. Okay? That's what gets people turned on about spending millions of dollars in Tokyo on an apartment complex. Now, I would love us to get to that point. Okay? I would love if developers and business owners said, if I put just another 1 or 2% into my building, to make it seismic resilient, I can get 40% more rent. Okay, because you guys will do that every day if you can get those kinds of returns. All right. So we want the market to function well in promoting resilience. So I want to give you a couple examples, though, of how the USRC rating system is being used really broadly, not just for commercial properties, but for residential and civic buildings. This is a building in Roseville, California, which is outside Sacramento. It's a civic building as part of the Roseville City Hall complex. They lease space to a community college, and they were able to achieve sort of the highest level of performance, a USRC Platinum rating, which means the building should be functional during and after the earthquake. Safe, of course, but functional and suffer just minimal non-structural kinds of cosmetic damage. And they were able to achieve this rating just by smart design. They didn't actually have to go over their budget in any way. This met the budget and the schedule that they had allocated. But by using a good engineer and being thoughtful about the design, they were able to achieve this. And this is what you will find, is that this is typically all it takes to make a building more resilient, is to be thoughtful about the design. Okay. Now let me go back. This building is one I'm super proud of. So this is one we just rated in San Francisco. This is a 9-story affordable housing complex. Okay, this is 100% affordable housing. 20% of these units in this 94-unit building will be used to house folks that were formerly homeless. Okay, this was developed by a nonprofit developer. This is a building that ordinarily would, to be honest, would be designed right at the bottom, right at the minimum that you'd have to do to get away with code, okay? Nobody's going to spend an extra dollar on this building because it's low income, affordable housing, rent controlled. And yet these are the most vulnerable populations we have. It's hard enough for these folks to find places to rent in places like San Francisco or Los Angeles now. What happens after an earthquake when a third of the apartment complexes aren't even functional? You think they're going to find another place to live? These are the folks that will most likely be homeless. But the engineer worked on this project, and all he had to do, he developed this really cool rocking shear wall system where he put some vertical dampers, like shock absorbers, in the basement of the building. Okay? And because of that design, the building should be functional within a couple weeks after the earthquake. So the amount of sort of temporary space that the city might have to find would be really greatly reduced versus months or years or never that a building like this would ordinarily suffer after a major earthquake. And the cost for that, on a $42 million project, the cost was $100,000. So 0.25%. All right. So the city was thrilled to invest that money because it knows it's not going to have to invest that money in shelter space after an earthquake. It's not going to have to figure out how to replace this building after an earthquake. So that's the kind of thing that thoughtful design can do. I'm so proud of this building because it addresses a need that most people forget about or don't want to think about. But we also have ratings on commercial properties. This was a really interesting property. This is a steel frame building in San Francisco. It was built between two existing buildings. And they, because it's built between existing buildings, you have to have a gap, right, between the buildings. So if the building moves around in an earthquake, it doesn't bang and hit one of the other buildings. Well, they decided that if they make this building really strong and really stiff, that gap shrinks. And that gap, the shrinking of that gap by only several inches, increased the rentable space by, several thousand square feet over the building. So the extra money they got, they can now achieve in rental space, paid for the cost to bring that building up to this higher, stiffer performance level. So here's a case where the owner didn't have to pay an extra dime, because he got that money back in rent, and was able to achieve a building that will achieve a high USRC rating. And then finally, here are, we have a lot of older buildings in the LA area, obviously. These are 4 older masonry buildings in Portland, Oregon. These are unreinforced masonry buildings, but they were all remodeled completely, went through a major renovation, so they were all brought up to modern code levels of performance. So even though each one of those buildings is 100 years old or more, they essentially comply with modern building codes because they were all gutted from the inside and had lots of a new structural system placed in it. And the building in the upper right there actually was on the National Historic Register. So it got a huge tax break for seismically upgrading the building, which paid for 3/4 of the cost of the upgrade itself. So you see, it's this kind of creative thinking about the design itself and how to access funding for the design or for resilient design can actually pay for and cover the kinds of costs that it will be. So having a long-term perspective about your building can really encourage this kind of performance. So that's what I want to encourage the business community, is to think about the long-term perspective and the cost that you will face if your building is damaged or unoccupiable after an earthquake, but also the kinds of incentives that you can find that are out there to help you make these buildings perform better. So one of the things that the USRC is really focusing on are these incentives. How can we incentivize owners to invest more in their buildings? Eventually, we want the market to be able to do this. We want that Tokyo situation there, where if you go online and Google, some super fancy condo in Los Angeles, it shows you a picture of the basement and the base isolator, and everybody says, yeah, I want that building. And I don't know if you all heard of the Millennial Tower in San Francisco, the one that's leaning, right? Those apartments cost several $1 million. It doesn't have anything to do with earthquakes, but I'm sure that the next person that buys a multi-million-dollar apartment in San Francisco is going to look to make sure that their building isn't on piles that are too short, right? So we're looking at things like expedited permitting. Those of you that are in business that own buildings or that have retail establishments know that getting your permit and getting in business quicker starts your revenue, whether you're renting an apartment or you've got a retail establishment. So it benefits the city to have a better building because it maintains their sales tax base. So if they offered something like an expedited permit for you to build to a higher level of performance, everybody wins. Tax breaks for owners that build to higher levels of performance. If you're a county and you rely on the property taxes of buildings, if the building's heavily damaged in the earthquake, the property tax essentially goes to zero. And so what does that mean? That means the county loses out on property taxes, all right? So maybe there's some incentive that a county can offer. Again, if you have a higher level of performance, they can give you some tax waiver or some tax break. And then we're looking for things like, real sort of discounts on loans. If you are a lender and you lend on a property, and there's an earthquake and that property is damaged, the borrower might just walk away from it and leave you holding the bag. Okay, so it's beneficial to the lender to offer you a discount on your mortgage if you build more resiliently because there's less risk of default. Same thing with insurance companies. There's a benefit to them to offer reduced insurance rates on better buildings because that reduces their claims. That means they can issue more policies. It reduces the insurance cost for the borrower. So these are all things that the U.S. Resiliency Council is working on right now. And so, I want to talk just for a second about some of the other national efforts that are going on in terms of resilience, but I do want to bring it back to Southern California as well. There are all sorts of things that are going on right now from the national level, certainly when it comes to things like hurricanes and floods, to offer incentives for people to build more resiliently. Whole cities and states have developed resilience plans that are in place to make sure that over time their building stock will improve so that their communities will be able to recover more. So there's a lot of stuff going on the national level, but really, if you bring it back to Los Angeles, the work that BizFed and its partners now, like Optimum Seismic and the LA city and county organizations, that really is leading the way. You may be frustrated. I'm sure many of you are frustrated with the pace of how these things go. Don't get me wrong. I get it. I've been an engineer for 30 years. I see how slow these things move. But when it comes to Los Angeles or Southern California, really, there are a few areas of the country that are doing more. So I can show you all this stuff on the screen about other national efforts. But, it was so unusual for me to start speaking at these events last year or the year before with Ali and Tracy, but then I got to see all the different people that were coming to these and all the different groups that were engaged, like we were in Santa Monica a couple weeks ago. And again, it's, you have all these diverse people, and that's what it takes. Just like BizFed is a organization of organizations, that's what we need. We need us all to sort of come together, find ways we can each contribute to incentivizing, sometimes mandating, but basically promoting this idea of resilience-based design is good for everybody. So again, these are just some of the folks that we're working with as well. We're working with insurance companies and lenders on insurance discounts. We're working with cities and the federal government on making grants available. Anything we can do to sort of incentivize the process of building more resiliently. I think that's it. Yeah, so from my perspective, we would really like you to be involved with the U.S. Resiliency Council. Optimum Seismic is a great supporter of ours and opening up opportunities. Johanna Cunningham here is on our board of directors. We've coordinated with KVCR in the Inland Empire on their sort of earthquake resilience miniseries. We'd like you all to be involved too. We'd like the support of the U.S. Of businesses and organizations in Southern California. We're a nonprofit. We continue to succeed by having the support and engagement of lots of different stakeholders. So, this benefits everybody. We hope you'll stay engaged with us. Thank you for coming today. I think it's very important that you're making this contribution just by coming here and learning more about resilience. So that's all I have. I don't know if we have any time for questions, or that's it. Okay. I'll be around afterwards if you have questions.